The recreation center aboard the Federation command ship Sovereign Dawn buzzed with voices from a dozen different worlds. Jake Morrison sat at a metal table, watching alien crew members share stories from their home planets. The young Marine from Texas still felt new to all this. 3 months ago, he had been fighting on Earth. Now he floated through space with creatures that looked like walking lizards and giant insects. Commander Zefkri, a 7-foot-tall reptilian with green scales, finished telling a story about ancient Saurian warriors who could fly without wings. The other aliens nodded with respect. Their stories always seemed to be about real things that actually happened on their worlds. "What about you, human?" Zefkri turned his yellow eyes toward Jake. "Do your people have any interesting historical tales?" Jake thought for a moment. He remembered the stories his grandmother told him as a child, stories about gods and monsters, heroes and magic, but compared to tales of actual flying warriors, they seemed silly. "Well," Jake began slowly, "we have stories about the Greek gods. There was this war in the sky between the Titans and the Olympians. The Titans were these giant beings who ruled before the gods came. Zeus and his brothers fought them for 10 years. The aliens listened politely at first. Jake described how Zeus threw lightning bolts and how the earth shook during the battle. He told them about Kronos eating his own children and how the gods finally won by freeing monsters from deep underground. As Jake spoke, he noticed the aliens starting to smile. Then came quiet chuckles. By the time he finished, several were laughing. "Openly? How charming," Zefkri said with a wide grin showing sharp teeth. "Your people created such creative explanations for natural events." Lightning storms became gods throwing bolts. Earthquakes became battles between giants. A slug-like alien named Morph-Tel wiggled with amusement. Primitive species always do this. They cannot understand weather patterns, so they invent sky wars. Jake felt his face grow hot. "These are important stories to us. They teach us about courage and fighting against impossible odds." "Of course they do." Zefkri patted Jake's shoulder with a clawed hand. "Every species needs its fairy tales." Amy Rodriguez, a pilot from California, looked up from her meal. She had been quiet during Jake's story, but now her dark eyes flashed with anger. "Fairy tales?" Amy stood up. "Let me tell you about Ragnarok. In Norse mythology, the gods themselves face their doom. The wolf Fenrir breaks free and eats Odin. The world serpent rises from the ocean and poisons the sky. The dead march with their armies. Everything burns and then the world begins again." She spoke with passion, describing warriors who knew they would die but fought anyway. She told them about Heimdall, who could see across all worlds, and Thor, who protected humans from giants with his mighty hammer. The aliens laughed even harder. A bird-like creature with blue feathers actually fell off its perch. "Oh my." Zefkri wiped tears from his eyes. "Your people really believe the dead could come back to fight? And magic hammers that control thunder? How wonderfully innocent." "The best part," added another alien, "is that they think wolves could grow big enough to eat gods. Did your ancestors never learn basic biology?" Amy's hands became fists. Jake could see she wanted to hit something. Several other human crew members at nearby tables looked angry too. But in the corner of the room, someone was not laughing. Dr. Kilovex, an insect-like historian with large, compound eyes, sat very still. She had been quiet the whole time, just listening. While the others mocked the human stories, she seemed to be thinking hard about something. "Your myths mention specific details," she said in her clicking voice. "These giants and monsters you describe, what did they look like exactly?" Jake was surprised by her serious tone. "Well, the Titans were huge. Some had 100 hands, others breathed fire or had snakes for hair. They could change shape and move between worlds. The Norse giants could also travel between realms," Amy added. "They lived in a place called Jotunheim, and some of them weren't really giants at all, just beings with strange powers." Dr. Kilovex's antennae twitched. Something about these descriptions bothered her, but she could not figure out what. Zefkri waved a dismissive claw. "Humans and their imaginations. You created monsters to explain things you could not understand. Every primitive world does this. At least we kept our stories alive, Jake said quietly. These tales survived thousands of years. Generation after generation passed them down. They meant something to our people. Yes, Morphtel gurgled with laughter. They meant your species had no real science. Lucky for you, the Federation found Earth when it did. Imagine if you had stayed primitive for another 1,000 years. The other aliens agreed loudly. They began sharing more stories about cute, primitive beliefs they had studied. Jake felt sick listening to them. Amy looked ready to start a fight, but Dr. Kilovex remained quiet. Something nagged at the back of her mind. The human descriptions reminded her of something she had read long ago in the deepest archives. Something about forbidden zones and classified warnings. As the laughter continued, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin her own research into human mythology. Not to mock it, but to understand why these stories felt so strangely familiar. Come on, Amy whispered to Jake. Let's get out of here. They left the recreation center while the aliens continued making jokes about human fairy tales. Behind them, Dr. Kilovex watched them go, her compound eyes reflecting deep thought. The historian had a feeling that human stories might be more than simple myths, but she could not yet imagine how much more. Dr. Kilovex could not sleep. She kept thinking about the human stories from the recreation center. Something about them felt wrong, but not in the way her colleagues believed. They laughed because the stories seemed impossible. She worried because they seemed too familiar. The next morning, she made her way to the ship's massive digital archives. The room hummed with quantum processors that could access the knowledge of 1,000 worlds. Dr. Kilovex had spent years here, studying the Bao history of dozens of species, but she had never looked closely at Earth's records. She began with basic searches: human mythology, folk tales, ancient stories. The computer displayed thousands of entries. Every culture on Earth seemed to have stories about gods and monsters. Chinese dragons that controlled weather, Egyptian gods with animal heads, Hindu epics about demons and divine weapons. At first it looked like what her colleagues said: primitive people making up stories to explain things they could not understand. But as Dr. Kilovex dug deeper, patterns began to appear. Patterns that made her antenna twitch with concern. A soft chime announced someone entering the archives. Dr. Lisa Chen, the human cultural attaché, walked in carrying a cup of coffee. She was a small woman with kind eyes and black hair pulled back in. A simple style. Dr. Kilovex? Lisa approached carefully. I heard you were researching human culture. Is there something I can help you with? The insectoid historian considered her words. I am conducting a study of primitive belief systems. Your species' mythology contains interesting, structural elements. Lisa's smile became a little forced. The word primitive clearly bothered her, but she kept her voice polite. I'd be happy to help. I studied folklore at Columbia University before joining the Federation. They worked together for hours. Lisa explained the connections between different mythologies, how the flood stories appeared in cultures around the world, how similar monsters showed up in the tales of people who had never met each other. You see? Lisa said, pulling up a holographic display. The Mesopotamian Anunnaki, the Greek Titans, and the Hindu Asuras all share certain characteristics. They're described as beings of immense power who ruled before current gods. They could manipulate reality itself. Dr. Kilovex studied the display. The descriptions made her deeply uncomfortable, though she could not explain why. These beings you describe, they could travel between dimensions. Many of them, yes. The Celtic Tuatha De Danann could move between worlds. Norse gods traveled through the 9 realms using Yggdrasil, the world tree. Hindu texts describe vimanas that could fly between different planes of existence. A new voice joined the conversation. The Aboriginal Dreamtime stories are similar. Lieutenant Ben Hayes, a communications officer from Maine, had quietly entered the archives. He was tall and red-haired with the pale skin of his Irish ancestors. Lieutenant Hayes, Lisa smiled. Ben knows more about Celtic mythology than most college professors. Ben pulled up a chair. My great-grandmother came from County Cork. She made sure we learned the old stories. The Tuatha De Danann weren't just magical people. They were described as beings of light who could become solid or fade away at will. They fought the Fomorians, who were chaos beings from under the sea. Dr. Kilovex's compound eyes widened. Chaos beings. What exactly does that mean? Creatures that existed to unmake order. Ben explained. They didn't just want to rule. They wanted to tear apart the very fabric of reality. The stories say they could make people forget who they were, or drive them mad just by being seen. Something cold crawled up Dr. Kilovex's spine. She had read descriptions like that before in the most classified sections of Federation archives. Files that required the highest security clearance. Files about the quarantined zones. These are just stories. Of course, Lisa said quickly, noticing the historian's distress. Symbolic representations of the struggle between order and chaos. But Dr. Kilovex was no longer listening. She was thinking about coordinates. Ancient mathematical principles embedded in human mythological structures. The golden ratio appearing in temple designs. Star maps hidden in constellation myths. Navigational data preserved in stories about heroes' journeys. I need to cross-reference something, she said suddenly. Could you help me translate more of these stories? Especially ones that mention specific locations or describe unusual phenomena? For the next several hours, they worked together systematically. Ben shared Irish tales of the Sida and their hidden doors to other worlds. Lisa provided Greek stories about gates to Tartarus and Hindu descriptions of Patala, the underworld realms. Each story contained geographical details that seemed random, but formed patterns when viewed together. Dr. Kilovex began plotting the locations on galactic maps. Slowly, a terrifying picture emerged. The places described in human mythology corresponded to star systems in the quarantine zones, areas of space that had been forbidden to all Federation ships for reasons lost to time. My God, Lisa whispered, looking at the display. These coordinates, they're real places? They are sectors that no Federation ship has visited for over 10,000 years, Dr. Kilovex replied quietly. Regions classified at the highest levels. Ben leaned forward. Why are they quarantined? Dr. Kilovex hesitated. She was breaking a dozen Federation protocols just by admitting the zones existed. But the implications of what they had discovered were too important to ignore. I do not know the complete truth, she said finally. But the oldest archives contain warnings, references to ancient conflicts, wars that nearly destroyed galactic civilization. Lisa's face went pale. You're saying our myths might be historical records? I am saying that your species seems to have preserved detailed information about things that other civilizations have worked very hard to forget. They sat in silence for a moment, staring at the star map dotted with quarantine markers. Each forbidden zone corresponded to locations mentioned in human stories. There's something else, Ben said quietly. In the old Irish stories, there were prophecies, signs that would appear when the ancient enemies returned, when the barriers between worlds grew thin again. Dr. Kilovex felt a chill run through her exoskeleton. What kind of signs? Stars going dark, ships disappearing without trace, people reporting nightmares that felt more real than waking life. As if summoned by his words, an alarm began sounding. Throughout the ship, emergency lights bathed the archives in red. A voice echoed through the communication system. All senior staff report to the bridge immediately. We have received a priority distress signal from the Kepler sector. Dr. Kilovex's blood turned to ice. The Kepler sector bordered one of the quarantine zones, one of the areas marked clearly on their human mythology star map. The three of them looked at each other with growing fear. The ancient stories might be more than historical records. They might be warnings about something that was beginning to wake up. Dr. Kilovex broke protocol that night. Using her historian credentials, she accessed Federation archives that required the highest security clearance, files that had not been opened in thousands of years. What she found in those digital vaults shook her to her core. The Void Wars. A conflict so devastating that the surviving civilizations had agreed to erase it from general knowledge. The enemy forces were not like anything the galaxy had ever faced. They existed partially outside normal space and time. Conventional weapons passed through them harmlessly. Entire fleets would engage these beings and simply vanish, leaving no trace except empty space where star systems used to exist. Dr. Kilovex read report after report of failed military campaigns. The Zephyrian Empire, masters of plasma technology, had thrown their best weapons at the enemy with no effect. The Crystalline Collective, beings of pure thought, found their mental attacks turned back on themselves with crushing force. Even the ancient builders who could reshape matter at the molecular level proved helpless against foes that barely existed in their reality. But buried deep in the classified files, she found references to one species that had shown effectiveness against the void entities. A young race from a small blue planet in an outer spiral arm. Humans. The files described them as psychologically resilient and capable of maintaining combat effectiveness when confronting incomprehensible threats. The war had ended when massive prison worlds were constructed around dimensional weak points. The void entities were sealed away, and the locations were designated as permanent quarantine zones. The participating civilizations agreed to forget the war had ever happened. Memories were wiped. Records were classified beyond reach. The galaxy moved forward as if the nightmare had never occurred. Except on Earth. Somehow humans had kept the memories alive. They had passed down the stories of gods and monsters, heroes and cosmic battles. Their myths were not fantasies. They were historical accounts of the greatest war the galaxy had ever known. Dr. Kilovex was still reading when her personal communicator chimed. Jake Morrison's voice came through, sounding urgent. "Doc, we need to talk. Something's happening." She found Jake and Amy in a maintenance corridor away from the main crew areas. Both humans looked worried and tired. "We've been having dreams," Amy said without introduction. "Not normal dreams, memories that aren't ours." Jake nodded. "I keep seeing battles in space. Ships that look nothing like Federation designs fighting against things that hurt to look at. And I know how to fight them. Tactics and strategies are just appearing in my head." "Other humans are reporting the same thing," Amy added. "It's like something is waking up inside us." Dr. Kilovex felt her worst fears confirmed. "How many others?" "All of them," Jake said quietly. "Every human on the ship is having the same kind of dreams. Ancient memories that feel more real than reality." Before Dr. Kilovex could respond, the ship's emergency alarm began blaring. Captain Tormalik's voice echoed through the corridors. "All hands to battle stations. We have confirmed reports of contact with unknown entities in the Kepler sector. Long-range sensors show impossible readings. Entire star systems appear to be fading." The three of them rushed to the nearest observation deck. Through the massive windows, they could see other Federation ships moving into formation. Emergency lights bathed everything in red. But Jake and Amy were not looking at the ships. They were staring out into deep space with expressions of terrible recognition. "They're coming," Amy whispered. "I can feel them, like holes in reality that want to swallow everything." Dr. Kilovex had to know the truth. She made a decision that would either save her career or end it. "I need to tell you both something. Your human myths are not stories. They are historical records." She quickly explained what she had discovered. The Void Wars, the quarantine zones, the fact that Earth had been a battlefield in an ancient conflict that the rest of the galaxy had chosen to forget. Jake and Amy listened in stunned silence. When she finished, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out an old military medal. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said quietly. "He died in World War II. But lately, when I hold it, I see different battles. Older ones, men fighting, things that shouldn't exist." Amy nodded slowly. "My abuela used to tell me stories about the ancient ones, beings that lived before humans, who would return when the stars were right. I thought they were just folk tales from Mexico. They were warnings," Dr. Kilovex said. "Your entire species has been carrying genetic memories of the last time these entities broke free." A new alarm joined the first one. Captain Tormalik's voice returned, but this time it shook with fear. Unknown entities have been detected approaching. The Kepler defense grid. All ships report that conventional weapons have no effect. The entities appear to exist partially outside normal space-time. Request immediate assistance from Federation Central Command. Through the observation window, they could see distant flashes of light. The Kepler defense grid was engaging something, but the lights were winking out one by one. "How do we fight them?" Jake asked. His voice was steady despite the terror in his eyes. Dr. Kilovex pulled up her research files on a portable display. "According to the ancient records, your species developed unique tactics, methods that worked when nothing else did, but the specifics were lost when the memories were suppressed." Amy studied the display showing human mythological references. "Not lost, hidden. These stories we've been telling for thousands of years. They're instruction manuals." Jake's eyes widened with understanding. "The Greek heroes didn't just fight monsters for glory. They were teaching us how to survive encounters with cosmic horrors. Perseus used mirrors to fight Medusa because you cannot look directly at some entities." Amy continued the thought. "Odysseus tied himself to the mast to resist the sirens because some enemies attack through mental influence." Dr. Kilovex felt pieces clicking together in her mind. "Your Ragnarok stories describe the end of the world, but also its rebirth, a cycle of destruction and renewal." "Because that's what happens when the barriers fail," Jake said. "Reality gets torn apart and rebuilt, but someone has to survive the destruction to guide the renewal." The ship shuddered around them. Through the windows they could see that the distant battle was getting closer. Several Federation vessels hung motionless in space, their lights dark. "We need to get to the command bridge," Amy said. "The captain needs to know what we're facing." As they rushed through the corridors, Dr. Kilovex realized that everything was about to change. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years pretending the Void Wars never happened, but the seals were failing, and the ancient enemy was returning. Tertier. Only species that remembered how to fight them were the humans everyone had been mocking as primitive. Their fairy tales were about to become the galaxy's only hope for survival. The command bridge of the Sovereign Dawn erupted in chaos when Dr. Kilovex, Jake, and Amy arrived. Officers from a dozen species worked frantically at their stations, but their voices carried an edge of panic that Jake had never heard before. Captain Tormalik, a proud cetacean with blue-gray skin, turned his massive head toward them. His usually calm demeanor had cracked. "Dr. Kilovex, we need answers. Our scouts report impossible readings from the Kepler sector. Ships are encountering entities that should not exist." "Captain," Dr. Kilovex began carefully, "I believe we are facing the return of forces from the Void Wars." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Several alien officers exchanged confused glances. Commander Zefkri, the same reptilian who had mocked human stories the day before, stepped forward. "The Void Wars are classified mythology," he said dismissively. "Ancient rumors with no factual basis." Before Dr. Kilovex could respond, the main view screen crackled to life. A emergency transmission came through from the Federation destroyer, Stellar Pride. The image showed Captain Vextor, a veteran Saurian commander, but his scales had turned pale with terror. "This is Captain Vextor of the Stellar Pride. We have engaged unknown hostiles. Our weapons have no effect. The entities appear to exist partially outside normal reality. My crew cannot function. They are paralyzed with existential dread upon visual contact with the enemy." The transmission flickered as something dark passed across the screen. When the image cleared, Captain Vextor was staring off camera with empty eyes. "They are beautiful and terrible," he whispered. "They show us the meaninglessness of existence. Why do we fight? Why do we live? There is only the void." The transmission ended abruptly. The bridge crew stared at the blank screen in horrified silence. "Get me a tactical report," Captain Tormalik ordered, his voice shaking. Lieutenant Chendar, a young avian officer, pulled up sensor readings with trembling feathers. "Sir, we have confirmed reports from 17 Federation vessels. All report the same phenomenon." Crew members become psychologically compromised upon contact with the entities. Only what, Lieutenant? Only the human crew members remain effective in combat, sir. All eyes turned to Jake and Amy. The two humans stood straighter under the attention, but Jake could see the weight of responsibility settling on Amy's shoulders. It's true, Jake said quietly. We can see them without losing ourselves. These things, they feed on despair. On the feeling that existence is meaningless, but humans have always faced that feeling and kept going anyway. Amy nodded. Our stories teach us that the universe might be cruel and random, but we fight anyway. Not because we know we'll win, but because fighting is what makes us human. Commander Zefkri scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Primitive. Psychology cannot overcome advanced entities. The tactical display suddenly lit up with new contacts. 12 objects had appeared at the edge of sensor range, moving toward them at impossible speeds. Incoming hostiles, Lieutenant Chendar reported. They don't register as solid matter, sir. On the main screen, the void entities became visible as they approached. Jake felt his mind struggle to process what he was seeing. They were not creatures in any normal sense. They were absences, holes in reality that moved with purpose and intelligence. Looking at them was like staring into the concept of nothingness itself. Around the bridge, alien crew members began to panic. Several fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the philosophical implications of beings that should not exist. The crystalline officer at the communication station began broadcasting messages of despair to the entire fleet, but Jake and Amy remained standing. They felt the same existential horror as everyone else, but their human minds had been shaped by thousands of years of stories about heroes facing impossible odds. Captain, Amy said firmly, request permission to take tactical command. Captain Tormalik looked at her with desperate hope. Do you know how to fight them? Our ancestors did, Jake replied. The knowledge is in our stories. Perseus used reflection to defeat enemies too dangerous to look at directly. We need to modify our targeting systems to use indirect sensor readings. Amy was already moving to a weapons station. Odysseus survived the sirens by binding himself against their influence. We need to implement isolation protocols for crew members who cannot handle direct contact. Dr. Kilovex pulled up her research files. The Hindu epic Mahabharata describes weapons that could destroy reality itself, but they required specific mental disciplines to use safely. The void entities were closing fast. As they approached, reality around them began to warp. Stars flickered and changed position. The laws of physics bent like rubber. Jake felt something awakening in his mind. Not just knowledge, but understanding. The genetic memories his species had carried for millennia were finally activating. He could see tactical possibilities that the ship's computers had missed. Fire Pattern 7, he called out, though he had never heard of Pattern 7 before. Target the spaces between them, not the entities themselves. Amy's hands moved across the weapons controls with practiced ease, following instincts she had inherited from ancestors who had fought this war before. Modified plasma bursts, focused on dimensional weak points. The Sovereign Dawn's weapons fired in a pattern that looked random, but created a web of energy barriers around the void entities. The beings suddenly slowed, their reality-warping effects contained within the energy grid. Impossible, Commander Zefkri breathed. How did you know that would work? Because Odin taught us about binding the wolf Fenrir, Jake replied without thinking. Some enemies cannot be destroyed, only contained. The other Federation ships, seeing the Sovereign Dawn's success, tried to copy the tactic. But without human crew members to guide them, their attempts failed. The void entities began breaking free of the energy barriers. We need to coordinate. The fleet, Amy said. But most of the alien crews are compromised. Dr. Kilovex looked at her with new respect. What do you need? Get me communication links to every human in the Federation fleet, Amy replied. And access to Earth's cultural database. We're going to need every myth, legend, and folktale our species ever preserved. As void entities swarmed toward the Federation fleet, humanity's ancient role as cosmic warriors began to awaken. The galaxy's survival would depend on stories that aliens had dismissed as primitive fantasies just days before. The real battle was about to begin. The Federation fleet hung in space like scattered jewels, each ship fighting its own desperate battle against enemies that defied understanding. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to admiral in the span of an hour, not through politics or protocol, but because he was one of the few beings in the galaxy who could look at void entities and still think clearly. From the command bridge of the Sovereign Dawn, Jake coordinated a battle that spanned 3 star systems. Every human crew member in the fleet had become a tactical advisor, sharing ancient wisdom disguised as children's stories. Beowulf formation, Amy called out over the fleet communication system. She was aboard the destroyer New Horizons, helping their Mantis crew implement fighting techniques from Anglo-Saxon poetry. Remember, the monster's strength comes from isolation. Fight as a group, support each other. Dr. Keela Vex had decoded the location of an ancient weapons cache hidden on Earth itself. The coordinates were embedded in the layout of Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, and a dozen other sacred sites that humans had built without understanding why. The weapons are there, she reported to Jake, but someone needs to retrieve them, while the main fleet holds the line. Amy's voice crackled through the communication system. I'll take a fast ship to Earth. My grandmother's stories mention something about sleeping guardians that wake when the world faces its darkest hour. Jake wanted to argue, to keep her safe, but he knew she was right. Earth held the key to victory, and Amy had the strongest connection to the old stories. Take Ben Hayes with you, Jake ordered. His Celtic knowledge might be crucial. As Amy's ship, the Valiant, broke away from the main fleet, Jake turned his attention back to the immediate battle. The void entities were learning, adapting their tactics. What had worked an hour ago no longer contained them. They're breaking through Sector 7, reported Lieutenant Martinez, a human communications officer who had somehow acquired expertise in Aztec warfare techniques. The Quetzal formation isn't holding. Jake closed his eyes and let the ancestral memories flow through him. Images of ancient battles filled his mind. Warriors who faced gods and monsters with nothing but courage and clever tactics. Switch to the Ragnarok Protocol, he commanded. All ships prepare for the final battle formation. The Federation fleet, now guided entirely by human tactical knowledge, began to move in patterns that echoed the great myths of Earth. Ships formed the outline of Yggdrasil, the World Tree, with each branch representing a different fighting unit. Meanwhile, Amy's ship streaked toward Earth through space that was becoming increasingly unstable. Reality rippled around them like water as void entities pressed against the barriers between dimensions. The storage readings are off the charts, Ben reported from the sensor station. There are massive energy signatures under every ancient site on Earth. As they entered Earth's atmosphere, Amy felt something she had never experienced before. The planet itself seemed to be waking up. Aurora patterns danced across the sky in colors that had no names. The magnetic field pulsed with rhythms that matched human heartbeats. They landed near Stonehenge, where British military forces were already excavating under emergency protocols. But as they approached the ancient stones, something unexpected happened. The Guardians were waking up. From burial mounds across the British Isles, figures began to emerge. They were human, but also more than human. Warriors and heroes from every age of Earth's history, preserved by forces that science could not explain. The once and future king, Ben whispered as a familiar figure approached. Arthur didn't die, he was waiting. King Arthur, accompanied by knights who bore weapons that hummed with power, nodded to Amy with ancient eyes. The final battle comes, Arthur said, in a voice that carried the weight of centuries, as was foretold. Around the world, similar awakenings were happening. In Egypt, pharaohs emerged from pyramids. In China, emperors rose from terracotta armies that were never meant to be just statues. In America, Native American spirits took physical form to fight alongside their descendants. Amy realized that Earth's greatest heroes had never truly died. They had been waiting, preserved as guardians for the day when humanity would need them most. Back in space, Jake felt the change immediately. Strength flowed into every human in the fleet. Not just tactical knowledge, but actual power drawn from the awakened guardians of Earth. "All ships, final assault formation," Jake commanded. His voice carried an authority that came from generations of human leaders. "We end this now." The Federation fleet moved as one, guided by strategies from every human culture that had ever faced impossible odds. Greek phalanx formations combined with Mongol horse tactics. Samurai discipline merged with Viking berserker fury. Apache guerrilla warfare met Roman engineering precision. The void entities, caught off guard by this sudden coordination and power increase, began to retreat toward their dimensional weak points. But Jake had studied his grandmother's stories too well to let them escape. "Deploy the binding protocols," he ordered. "Every myth about trapping cosmic enemies. Now, energy nets based on Celtic knot patterns wrapped around the retreating entities. Barriers inscribed with every protective symbol humanity had ever created sealed the dimensional rifts. The void beings found themselves caught in a prison made of pure human will and imagination. As the last entity was contained, silence fell across the fleet. The crisis was over, but everyone knew that everything had changed forever. Dr. Kilovex approached Jake with something like reverence in her compound eyes. "Your species. You were never primitive, were you?" Jake looked out at the stars, feeling the weight of his ancestors' sacrifices and the pride of their victories. "We were guardians, protectors of the galaxy's memory. We kept the warnings alive when everyone else chose to forget." Amy's voice came through from Earth's surface. "The weapons are secure and the guardians are returning to their rest, but they'll wake again if needed." Captain Tormalik, his earlier arrogance completely gone, addressed Jake with deep respect. "Admiral Morrison, the Federation Council has requested that Earth become the new headquarters of galactic defense. Your people will train our future officers." Jake nodded slowly. Humanity had spent centuries dreaming of joining galactic civilization. They had never imagined they would end up leading it. But as he looked around the bridge at alien crew members who now watched humans with awe instead of amusement, Jake realized that this had always been their destiny. They were the species that faced the dark and refused to surrender. They were the ones who turned nightmares into bedtime stories and taught children to be brave. The galaxy was safe, protected by warriors whose greatest weapons were the stories they refused to let die. "Commander," Zefkri approached Jake hesitantly. "Admiral, I owe your species an apology. We mocked your myths without understanding their true value." Jake smiled and clapped the reptilian officer on the shoulder. "No harm done, Commander. But next time someone tells you a story about heroes, fighting monsters, you might want to listen a little more carefully." As the Federation fleet began its journey home, Jake reflected on how much had changed. Humanity had gone from being the galaxy's newest members to its most important protectors in the span of a single battle. Their fairy tales had saved the universe, and somewhere in the distance, Earth's ancient guardians settled back into their eternal watch, waiting for the next time the galaxy would need heroes who refused to give up hope.